today. This is an album I got probably in the last 18 months, secondhand. Got this for 50 cents. This is Faith No More's second album, Introduce Yourself. The condition, you can see them, I kind of tilt it back. You can see the front cover is a bit grimy, and there's kind of a, well, not kind of, there is a crack across the plastic here, but it's not a big deal. Crack on the back as well. The CD itself, I've listened through this. Well, this is what you'll sometimes find, is that different players, CD players, handle discs differently. Whereas something might play absolutely fine, no problems on one player, might be some trouble on the other. I mean, when I first got this, I played this in our car. Our family car's got a CD player, and I played it through, and no issues. But then just it was about last week, I guess, a week or two ago, I was put this on my home CD player, and it had a bit of trouble getting started. And sometimes this player that I've got at home, I find that if the disc has some scratches on it, it will have trouble getting started on the first track. But if you skip to the second, it's usually okay from there. In this case, it was having trouble even on the second track. So I took it out and gave it a wipe and clean, and kind of tried to get anything visible off, and then played fine. So that's great. So yeah, I played through fine. A couple of times I played through it. The booklet is very sparse, but also a bit grimy. I'm not sure if that's showing up on the camera, but this came out in 1987. This was released in 1987. This was first generation, or one of the first generations of Faith No More, because they actually went through quite a lot of lineup differences, lineup changes before they really broke big. But this was their first main lineup with Chuck Mosley on vocals. And it was released on 87 on Slash Records. And there was a lot of subsequent releases, because I think it had only a very small press run when it was first released. So there's actually a bit of a rundown I found online. So there's had its first pressing in the North American market, UK, Germany, France, Australia, Japan. And then it had a second and third pressing in a few of those. This is the first Australian pressing. And the reason I know that is because it has this this barcode number D19617, and also it's put out on the Australasian market. It's put out by Slash and then Liberation Records. Don't know what Liberation Records is. You've actually heard of Liberation Records before, but they put it out 3 years later. So it was put out in 1990 in Australia. And that's why I know it's the first Australian pressing, but not the first US pressing, which came out 3 years earlier. So what I think happened is, what I can almost guarantee what happened was that The Real Thing, which was their first album with Mike Patton, and had epic, and it was probably their biggest selling album they ever had, that came out in '89, early '89, I think. What was it? Mid '89, and that did pretty well all around the world. And Faith No More always did pretty well down under in Australia and New Zealand. They always had a pretty solid sales down here, at least population wise. And so I guess the Real Thing did well, and so the Australian distributor, or whatever Liberation Records might be, decided to do a pressing of Introduce Yourself to capitalize on the newfound fame of Faith No More in Australia and New Zealand. And so that's why I think it was done the way it was done. Anyway, that's all kind of I guess, boring information. But the actual music itself. So like I said, this I never really gave the pre-Mike Patton albums much of a chance or a go. I didn't actually listen to them. So in my youth, I was a big fan of Faith No More. Faith No More were one of my favorite bands going when I was in my teenage years. And even to this day, I'd say they're still one of my favorite bands. And the first thing I ever heard of them was Epic, like most people. And I think I was a little bit older. I remember King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime came out. And I think I bought that, and then Album of the Year came out, and then I think I went back and bought Angel Dust. So I was a big Mike Patton fan. You might even say I was a Mike Patton fanboy. And it wasn't as though like, oh, I'm not listening to anything before Mike Patton. It was just like that stuff kind of saying, oh, I thought, oh, that's the old stuff. That probably is not very good, the stuff they did with the previous singer. And so I just never... And then after they broke up, they released their first greatest hits collection, which I can't remember the name of. I think that was around 1999. And that had, obviously songs from throughout their career, and it had from their Who Cares a Lot? Was it Who Cares a Lot? No, I'm sure of something else. Okay, well that's what it said. They said that it was the one that it was called Who Cares a Lot, and it had a picture of, who was that guy on the front? Oh, Benny Hill. It had Benny Hill on the front. Anyway, from that pre-Mike Patton era, they had the We Care a Lot song, and they also had Introduce Yourself. They were the only two songs. And I heard both those, and I thought, actually, they're not bad. They're a little bit different, but they're not bad. So you can still hear the basis of the Faith No More song, that kind of rhythm section of Billy Gould and Mike Borden. That's kind of very recognizable, especially Mike Borden's drum beats. But then again, I never really made much effort to kind of delve into their older stuff. And then I just think over the subsequent 20 years between then and now, I have kind of piece by piece heard bits and pieces. I saw them live. I've seen them live twice. I saw them live on the Album of the Year tour in 1997, which was kind of just before they broke up. They broke up not long after that. And that was one of the best concerts, even now, the best concert I've ever been to. For so many reasons. But I talked before about being at that age. I would have been 16 when I saw them then. And when you're 16 years old, there's something about that age, 15, 16, 17, maybe 18, where you're young enough and you have the brain of a young person where you can enjoy things in a different way. And that if I saw the same show now, I'm sure I'd still enjoy it, but it wouldn't be the same, if you know what I mean. And it's why I think having those kinds of experiences in your youth is so important, because you only have one youth. And you're often when you're growing up, your parents or your teachers or whoever tell you, you can, if you work hard now, you'll reap the benefits when you're older, and you can enjoy your life when you're older, which of course is true, and that's important. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but at the same time, I think there's something to be said of letting kids go out and enjoy their teenage years, because there's things that you experience then that you just can't. Once you're older, that part of your brain's closed, and you can't have that kind of fun ever again. You have different kinds of fun, of course. Another one I was thinking of when I went to my friend's house. I was younger than that. I would have been about 12 or 13. And it was his birthday party. And it was about 5 or 6 of us. And we stayed up all night playing Super Nintendo. I mean, we had Mortal Kombat and one of the WWF games and one of the Super Mario Brothers games. This would have been at early 90s. So it wasn't Super Mario Brothers, like the original one. It was anyway. Staying up and play video games when you're a kid. Well, I guess people do that when they're adults now, don't they, as well? But I don't know. Anyway, I saw them again in 2010 on their reunion tour. Brilliant show. And they played a few songs from their old. The one that I particularly remember them playing from this album was Chinese Arithmetic. And the reason why I remember them playing that is because they started off with the drum beat of that. You know, if you've heard Chinese arithmetic, you'll know it's got a very kind of Faith No More-esque drum beat that starts it off. They started off by doing that, so it sounded like Chinese arithmetic, starting up the bass line and the drum beat and even the keyboards. But then Mike Patton started singing the Lady Gaga song Poker Face because that fit with the drum beat as well. I think she uses the same drum beat on that song. So I'm probably not describing it very well, but yeah. And so, like I said, I found this a year and a half ago or so, and I listened through to the whole song, and I think it's actually a pretty good album with some pretty great songs. I like Faster Disco, I like Anne's song, I like Introduce Yourself, I like Chinese Arithmetic. I really like the Crab song. Death March, also okay. We Care a Lot's a good song. You know, it's quite it's kind of a, I don't know, like almost like a novelty song that's kind of going through different, you know, like a chant, we care a lot, and going through different things they care a lot about. Like Transformers and the Garbage Pail Kids and things that sound very late 80s. Chuck Mosley, the vocalist at the time, definitely sounds different than Mike Patton. Obviously. But I mean, not just as in he's got a different vocal, but it's just a different energy, and you can see how they changed. You can see the kind of the bridge of the Real Thing. The Real Thing still has the kind of instrumentation sound and vibe of this album, but by the time they get to Angel Dust, I feel that Mike Patton's influence has really kind of pushed them off into left field and away from this sound. And then as the albums progressed, they, like I said, they always kept the bass and the drums. I felt was always kind of the foundation of Faith No More, and that's a kind of theme that you can hear from their first through to even the stuff they did not long ago, the Soul Invictus album. That kind of, yeah, I've heard it described as tribal beats, the way that Mike Patton plays the drums. But he does kind of play the drums in a very different way than most other kind of drummers of that period or that era. He's not just a traditional rock 4/4 rock drummer or funk drummer or anything like that. He kind of he's got his own sound, Mike Patton. And then Billy Gould's bass, I think, really complements the two, go together perfectly. And then Roddy Bottum's keyboards, they've kind of come and gone. Again, I think they form a kind of a foundational sound of Faith No More as well. And they were much more prominent in this era and the Real Thing. And they kind of, they've still been there. I guess King for a Day is where they kind of dropped off the most, because that was almost kind of the most straight ahead alternative rock, almost metal sounding album. You know, like a song like Dig in the Grave or Ricochet or what's the first song on that? Get Out. They're just kind of, yeah, straight ahead alternative metal hard rock songs. They kind of don't have that same kind of I don't know what you say. They don't have the keyboards as much, and so it kind of loses something of that faith. I love that album. I think those are all great songs, but it kind of doesn't have that same Faith No More real sound that the other ones, the earlier stuff does. But then when they get to album of the year, they kind of go back towards that, but with a little bit of a new growth. Then when they get to Soul Invictus, I think they've kind of incorporated it all together. Well, I haven't listened to that album as much as I've listened to their previous stuff. I've listened through to it a bunch of times, but I haven't kind of absorbed it as much as their other albums, which are kind of, I've listened to so much that they're like part of my DNA at this point. But yeah, sadly, Chuck Mosley died relatively recently. I think in the last 5-10 years. You know, the reason I think they got rid of him was because he had pretty serious substance abuse issues, and it was making it hard for the band to kind of find their way forward. And after this album, they booted him. And he died in 2017, so about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Which is always sad to hear, when people kind of don't. You think maybe they've got over the problem that they had, but even that, however many years later, it's over 30 years later, he's still struggling to the point where he passed away. Yeah, so all in all, it's a very good album, and you can hear it's part of the Faith No More legacy. It's got certainly a more raw vibe, but you can hear the connection with the stuff that came after it. And I think the songs are legitimately good songs. The album definitely holds up. Which may be their first album. What was their first album called? Was that called We Care A Lot, wasn't it? That maybe doesn't hold up as much. The production of that is a little bit not as good, I guess. It's more, when I say raw, but not particularly in a good way raw, Anyway, we'll leave it there. Faith No More, introduce yourself.